Picture a Viking. Chances are the image that arrives is tall, broad-shouldered, hair the colour of winter wheat, eyes somewhere between grey and the North Sea on a clear morning. That image has been reproduced on film posters, painted on pub signs, stitched into festival banners, and sold in airport gift shops from Oslo to Copenhagen. It feels ancient and authoritative. It feels, in a word, true. But what if it isn't? What if the people who launched those famous longships, who navigated by stars and sea colour, who buried their dead in boats packed with weapons and walrus ivory, looked considerably more varied than the legend allows? And what if the raids themselves, those violent, fast shore-breaking expeditions that shaped medieval Europe, actually changed something in the biology of the people who carried them out and the lands they touched? That is the question this video is going to sit with. Did Viking raids influence how Scandinavians look today? The honest answer is that it depends entirely on what you mean by look, by Viking, and by today. Because the genetics, the archaeology, the ships and the graves have all started quietly dismantling the simpler story. What they are building in its place is stranger and more interesting, which is always the way history works when you follow it past the comfortable version. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. Now, Scandinavia. To understand why the people who came from this part of the world look and are the way they are, you have to start with the geography, because the geography is not a backdrop, it is an engine. Scandinavia is a maritime world before it is anything else. Fjords cut deep into the Norwegian interior, some of them running so far inland that they feel less like coastlines and more like long corridors of cold water leading somewhere vital. The Swedish coast breaks into thousands of islands. Denmark faces the sea in nearly every direction, sitting at the hinge between the Baltic and the North Atlantic, a crossroads without walls. Even the overland routes between settlements were often slower and harder than a boat. This meant that from the very beginning, the people who lived here were shaped by movement. Not just their own movement outward, but the movement of others inward. Sea lanes do not work in one direction. They bring traders, settlers, raiders, refugees, and the genes that travel quietly alongside all of them. The coastal zones of Scandinavia were, in this sense, never truly isolated. They were permeable, constantly absorbing and sending out, mixing in ways that left traces in the bones and eventually in the genomes we can now read. That genetic record is one of the main threads running through this video. A landmark study published in Nature in 2020 analysed the genomes of more than 400 Viking Age individuals, and what it found cut against almost every visual assumption we carry about this period. Dark hair was not the exception among Vikings, it was common. The pigmentation genes of Viking Age populations differed substantially from those of modern Danes, reflecting centuries of gene flow from southern Europe, and, to a lesser degree, from further east. There were 3 broad genetic clusters across the Viking world, mapped loosely onto what we now call Denmark, Sweden and Norway, and the greatest diversity was found not inland, but along the coasts, exactly where the sea lanes ran. The implications of that finding ripple outward in every direction. They touch the question of what a Viking actually was. They touch the discovery that the lactase persistence gene, the one that lets adults digest dairy milk without difficulty, appears to have spread through Scandinavian populations during the Viking period, leaving a metabolic signature in modern bodies that you would not immediately think to connect to a longship. They touch the Salmi ship burial in Estonia, where 4 brothers were interred together, evidence that these expeditions were often family affairs rather than purely mercenary ones. They raise the possibility that Viking identity was something you could adopt rather than something you simply inherited at birth, and they touch the ships themselves. The Oseberg longship, a 21-metre oak vessel discovered in a 9th century burial mound in Norway, remains one of the most extraordinary objects to survive from the Viking Age. When a modern replica called the Saga Oseberg was built using traditional techniques and launched in 2012, it sailed at 10 knots. That is not a museum piece performing nostalgia. That is a vessel that still works, still moves, still tells you something real about what the people who built the first one were capable of. Graves, genomes, and ships. Each one is a kind of archive, and each one, when read carefully, begins to complicate the legend. The story of how Scandinavians came to look the way they do today is not a simple story of Vikings spreading their genes across a continent and sailing home. It is a story of coasts and crossings, of families making dangerous journeys together, of cultures borrowing from one another in ways that left marks on bone and blood that we are only now learning how to read? The answer is complex because appearances always are. They are not a single type inherited cleanly from a single moment. They are a mosaic built across centuries. Let us begin with what came before the sails even filled. Long before the first longship broke from a Norwegian fjord with its painted prow aimed at a foreign shore, the sea was already doing what seas do best. It was connecting people who had no business being connected. Consider the Hjortspring boat, built around 400 BC, roughly 12 centuries before anyone started calling these waters the Viking world. It was a sewn plank vessel nearly 19 metres long, capable of carrying at least 20 paddlers, and it was found in a bog in southern Denmark. The craftsmanship is startling. The overlapping planks, the elegant taper at both ends, the clear understanding of how water behaves and how a hull should answer it. Whoever built that boat had not stumbled onto maritime technology. They had inherited it, refined it, practiced it. The sea lanes of the Baltic and the southern Scandinavian coasts were already old arteries by the time the Hjortspring crew launched. By the Roman Iron Age, roughly the first 4 centuries of the Common Era, those arteries were carrying remarkable cargo. Scandinavian coasts received imported Roman coins, Mediterranean glassware, bronze vessels and worked iron. These were not accidental deposits washed ashore. They are the residue of sustained exchange, of merchants and emissaries and negotiators who crossed open water because there was something worth reaching on the other side. Estimates put the combined population of what is now Denmark, Norway and Sweden at around 750,000 people by 1 AD, a number large enough to sustain real networks of trade, kinship and communication across long distances. And then there is the Nidum ship from around 310 AD, discovered in southern Denmark. A rowing vessel, built for rivers and coastal waters both, demonstrating that the movement between inland settlements and the open coast was constant and intentional. The sea was not a boundary here, it was infrastructure. But here is something that the genetics quietly reveal, something worth holding on to as this story develops. Scandinavia before the Viking Age was not a single, uniform population waiting to expand. Ancient DNA analysis has identified at least 2 distinct clusters already present in the Iron Age, a northern group encompassing Norway and northern Sweden, and a southern group centred on Denmark and southern Sweden. The statistical differentiation between these groups is small, barely perceptible in the numbers, but it is real. The people living along the Trondheim coast were not genetically identical to the people living near the mouth of the Elbe, even if they shared shipbuilding traditions and certain gods. Regional differences were already baked in. The coasts and the inland zones tell different stories here, and that contrast matters. Along the waterways, contact was constant. Trade goods moved, and so did people, and when people move over generations, genes follow. Strontium isotope studies from burial sites on the Swedish island of Öland show that most individuals grew up locally, spending their whole lives within a familiar radius, but a consistent minority had childhood origins somewhere else entirely, their bones carrying chemical signatures of distant coastlines. These were not necessarily raiders or merchants. Some were almost certainly husbands and wives, moving along the Baltic shore as part of marriage alliances between families who understood that a good match 100 kilometres away was worth the crossing. The waterways were, among other things, a marriage market, a network of social obligations maintained by the same vessels that also carried furs and amber and news. Further inland, the picture shifts. Communities nestled between hills and forest, away from the coastal corridors, show greater continuity, less outside contact, more of the slow drift that comes from relative isolation. The sea created both extremes simultaneously. Along the fjords and the island-scattered coasts, intense mixture and exchange. Further back from the water, quieter persistence. This is the world the Viking Age was born from. Not a blank slate, not a sudden eruption of violent energy from nowhere, but the acceleration of something already in motion. The roots were known. The shipbuilding knowledge was deep. The habit of crossing water to find something or someone on the other side was centuries old. What changed in the 8th century was the scale and the ambition, the reach of those voyages, and the nature of what they were sometimes looking for when they arrived. The sails did not fill on an empty sea. They filled on a sea that already knew them. Around 750 CE, something shifted in the rhythm of that ancient sea traffic. The crossings became longer. The ambitions grew harder to contain within familiar horizons. What had been a coastwise tradition of exchange and seasonal movement began reaching outward in directions that would have seemed almost incomprehensible to earlier generations. A half-century of maritime expansion was beginning, one that would not exhaust itself until roughly 1050, and in that 300-year span, the known world effectively doubled for the people who lived at its northern edge. The first voyages that historians point to are often the raids, the ones that left written records because the people on the receiving end were literate and frightened enough to set down what they saw. The monastery at Lindisfarne in 793, the coastline of Francia through the 800s, the Irish settlements disrupted again and again by fleets moving so fluidly that they seemed to materialize from the fog and dissolve back into it before anyone could mount a response. But to focus only on those violent episodes is to misread the underlying mechanism. The raids were one expression of a much larger restlessness, a societal shift in what ships were being used for and how far people were willing to travel in them. The more complete picture looks something like this. A young man from a fjord community in western Norway might spend one summer raiding along the coast of England, carrying back silver and a reputation. The following year he might join a trade convoy moving south through the Baltic, carrying furs and walrus ivory to markets near the Slavic rivers. The year after that he might take passage further east, following the Volkhov and the Dnieper in a chain of river portages that eventually connected to Constantinople, where Norse mercenaries served in the palace guard of Byzantine emperors. These were not separate phenomena. They were different seasons of the same mobile life, and the ships made all of it possible. What emerges from the archaeology and the genetics combined is not a single kingdom launching coordinated campaigns. It is a network. Ports and seasonal camps, small harbours and fortified overwintering sites, strung together by the logic of prevailing winds and the practical knowledge of where shelter could be found. Researchers studying the western Norwegian coast have identified what they call a corridor of havens, sheltered anchorages spaced within roughly 2 to 3 nautical miles of each other, along what Old Norse sources simply called the Nordvei, the Northern Way. This coastal lattice was not incidental. It was the infrastructure of expansion, a chain of known stopping points that let crews push farther with each season, resting, provisioning, reading the weather, and moving again. As the Viking Age deepened, that lattice evolved. The dense weave of small coastal stops gradually gave way to a smaller number of larger ports, places like Bergen and Dublin, that grew into genuine urban centres precisely because they sat at the intersections of these long-range routes. And what moved through those networks was not only goods, it was people, in numbers that the written sources consistently undercount. Whole families settled the Faroe Islands, then Iceland, then the thin green edge of southern Greenland. A Norse party reached the coast of North America around 1020, leaving behind the archaeological ghost of a settlement at Lanceau Meadows. Other groups pushed south and east. Norse warriors, traders, and their dependents established communities in Dublin and York, along the Danelaw, in Normandy, in Sicily. The Varangian Guard in Constantinople drew recruits from Scandinavia for generations, young men crossing half a continent to swing an axe for a Byzantine emperor. Meanwhile, archaeological evidence in places as far apart as Newfoundland and the Caspian shore carries the material signatures of the same seafaring culture, similar brooch types, similar ship rivets, similar ways of storing things and burying the dead. This mobility is the critical variable when it comes to understanding what happened genetically in the centuries that followed. People who move across continents do not travel in a sealed bubble. They interact with the populations they encounter, through trade partnerships and political alliances, through violence and its aftermath, through the quieter commerce of people simply finding each other attractive or useful across a cultural boundary. Ancient DNA work published in Nature in 2020 detected clear signals of Southern European and Central Asian ancestry embedded within Viking Age individuals from Scandinavia, ancestry that was not there in the same proportions before the expansion began, and that appears in varying degrees in modern Danish, Swedish and Norwegian populations today. The ships did not just carry Scandinavians outward. The routes they opened carried new ancestry back. Picture it from the perspective of a harbour settlement on the southern coast of Jutland sometime in the mid-9th century. Ships arrived from the west carrying people who spent 3 years in Ireland. Ships arrived from the east carrying traders who spent a winter near the great Slavic rivers. Some of those travellers stay, some marry into local families, some bring slaves or servants who themselves carry ancestry from Britain, from the Frankish lowlands, from places further still. The settlement is not a fixed ethnic enclave. It is a node in a living network, and the network breathes people in and out with the seasons. Every generation the local gene pool reflects that breathing. This is what makes the Viking world so resistant to simple summary. It was not a nation with borders and a census. It was a condition of motion, a way of organising life around the fact that the sea could be crossed, and that crossing it was often worth the risk. The Norse term for going raiding, i Viking, described an activity, a practice, a way of moving through the world, not a fixed identity stamped onto people at birth. That distinction matters enormously, and it is something the genetics are only beginning to illuminate. Because if Viking was something you did rather than something you simply were, then the people doing it could come from many origins, and the communities they built along their routes would reflect that plurality. What the ships were carrying, in other words, was not a uniform population. They were carrying a mobile and increasingly diverse set of individuals, bound together by shared technologies, shared gods, shared habits of the sea, but not by any single thread of ancestry that could be mapped onto a single appearance or a single place of origin. The diversity was built into the motion itself. You cannot send fleets across a continent for 3 centuries without the people in those fleets changing, and without the places they left from changing in turn. The ports grew, the routes extended, the network pulsed with seasonal movement, summer raids and autumn homecomings and winter planning and spring departures. And somewhere inside all of that restless traffic, the genetic and cultural makeup of Scandinavia was quietly being renegotiated, not all at once, not by any single dramatic event, but steadily, voyage by voyage, season by season, in the way that all great transformations actually happen, not as a wave breaking, but as a tide rising, almost imperceptibly, until one day the shoreline has moved and no one can say exactly when it shifted. The world those ships were building was already far more complicated than the legends would later suggest, and the complications are worth following. So when researchers began extracting and sequencing ancient DNA from Viking Age burial sites across Scandinavia, they were not expecting the picture to be simple. The previous section ended with the observation that the Viking world was already more complicated than its legend suggested. The genetics confirmed that complication in a remarkably precise way. Working with genetic material drawn from 442 individuals who lived and died during the Viking Age, researchers identified something that had previously existed only as an educated guess. Scandinavia was not genetically uniform. It never had been. And during the Viking Age specifically, the population organised itself into 3 broad genetic clusters that map, with striking closeness, onto the territories we now call Denmark, Sweden and Norway. Not perfectly, not with sharp lines where one ended and the next began, but clearly enough that if you plotted those individuals on a map and coloured them by their genetic similarity, 3 distinct clouds would emerge, each one centred roughly where you would expect it to be. Think of it less like 3 separate rooms and more like 3 regions of the same large space, shading gradually into one another, but each with its own centre of gravity. Danish individuals tended to carry ancestry that later shows up prominently in England, consistent with the historical record of Danish raiding and settlement along the English coast and throughout the Danelaw. Swedish individuals showed stronger connections eastward into the Baltic, which aligns neatly with the archaeological evidence of Swedish-origin traders pushing into the river systems of what is now Russia and Latvia. Norwegian individuals carried ancestry that echoes through the later populations of Ireland, Iceland and Greenland, destinations that Norse settlers from western Norway reached first and most persistently. Each cluster, in other words, had its own direction of travel, its own gravitational pull outward, and the populations those travellers eventually encountered left traces in both directions. What is particularly striking is where those clusters became most pronounced and where they softened. The answer lies in the geography, and it is exactly what you might predict once you think about how these people actually lived. Inland communities, the farming settlements tucked back from the water, the valleys where the same families had worked the same land for generations, showed a relatively stable and continuous gene pool. Less mixing, slower change, a genetic character that carried older patterns forward with fewer interruptions. Dig a grave in the inland regions of Viking Age Scandinavia, and you are likely sampling a community whose ancestry stretches back into the preceding centuries without dramatic disruption. Move to the coasts, and everything changes. The harbours and trading ports, the places where ships arrived and departed, where strangers spent winter months before moving on, where merchants and warriors and their dependents mingled across seasons and years, these were the diversity hotspots. Coastal sites showed significantly stronger signals of gene flow from outside Scandinavia altogether. Southern European ancestry, Central Asian ancestry, streams of genetic material arriving from directions that pure geography would not explain, carried by the maritime routes that connected northern Europe to the wider world. A coastal settlement in southern Denmark was not isolated. It was a receiver and transmitter, pulling in outside ancestry through the constant traffic of people and sending Scandinavian ancestry back out along the same routes. This inland coastal divide is one of the clearest patterns the data reveals, and it is worth visualizing carefully. Imagine standing on a ridge in central Norway looking down toward a fjord. The farming community behind you has been there for a long time. The people know each other's families, share the same pastures, inherit the same fields. Their genetic story is relatively slow-moving. Now look down toward the water. The settlement at the fjord's mouth is different. Ships have arrived there from Ireland, from the Northern Isles, from trading networks reaching into the Baltic. New people have stayed, married in, brought children who carry ancestry from places no one in the inland valley has ever visited. The genetic texture of the coast is finer grained, more varied, more responsive to the constant input of outside contact. This does not mean the inland communities were isolated in any absolute sense. They were connected to the coastal world through kinship, trade, and seasonal movement. But the pace of external mixing was slower, and that difference in pace is precisely what allowed the three clusters to remain identifiable at all. If every part of Scandinavia had been equally open to outside contact and internal movement, the clusters might have blurred into a single undifferentiated pool. Instead, the landscape itself created a pattern of variation, coasts more mixed, interiors more continuous, with gradients between them rather than sudden transitions. This is also why the three clusters help explain something that surprises people when they first encounter modern Scandinavian genetics. Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians are clearly related populations. They share a great deal of ancestry, speak mutually intelligible languages descended from Old Norse, and look, to an outside eye, broadly similar. But they are not genetically identical, and the differences between them are not random noise. They are the residue of these ancient patterns, preserved unevenly by geography and amplified by the different directions each group travelled during the Viking Age. The people who settled Iceland carried predominantly Norwegian ancestry. The people who shaped the Danelaw carried predominantly Danish ancestry. Those founding events, repeated and reinforced across generations, left descendants whose gene pools still carry the faint but measurable signature of which cluster their Viking Age ancestors came from. It is worth being clear about what the clusters do not mean, because the word cluster, in a genomic context, is easy to misread. It does not mean rigid borders. It does not mean ethnically pure populations sealed off from their neighbours. The boundaries between the Danish and Swedish clusters, for instance, are gradual rather than abrupt. Individuals near those geographic borders show mixed signals, as you would expect from people living at the intersection of overlapping networks. The clusters are statistical tendencies, not walls. They emerge from patterns of contact and movement rather than from any deliberate effort to keep populations separate. They are also partial pictures. The sample sizes for certain regions, particularly in eastern Scandinavia and along the Baltic contact zones, remain limited enough that researchers have cautioned against treating the diversity estimates as complete. Where fewer graves have been excavated and fewer individuals sampled, the genetic picture has larger gaps. Some of the apparent differences between clusters might shift as more data comes in from underrepresented areas. The pattern is robust enough to describe with confidence, but its edges remain subject to revision as the evidence grows. What the three clusters do offer, clearly and usefully, is a framework for understanding why the Viking Age produced related but distinct regional populations. Not one Scandinavian gene pool moving outward in a single direction, but three overlapping ones, each shaped by its own coastline, its own trade routes, its own preferred destinations, and its own incoming streams of outside ancestry. The genetic mosaic of Viking Age Scandinavia was not a simple picture. It was the natural result of 3 centuries of mobile life in a world where the sea was a highway and the coasts were its busiest intersections. And if the clusters themselves were more varied than later legend would suggest, the specific question of what those Viking Age people actually looked like carries its own surprises. The story of hair colour alone is enough to unsettle some of the most persistent images the modern world carries of who the Vikings were. Picture the Viking as most people imagine him. Tall, broad-shouldered, hair the colour of winter wheat, eyes somewhere between grey and the deep blue of open water. He wears a horned helmet in the popular imagination, though the archaeology disposed of that detail long ago. He stands at the prow of a longship, staring northward into the mist, looking exactly like the kind of ancestor a nation might want to claim for itself. That image is everywhere. It appears on tourism posters, in film and television, in the logos of sports franchises, and in the illustrated histories that schoolchildren across Scandinavia grew up reading. It feels ancient, as though it has always been there. But it is in large part a creation of the 19th century, and the genetics have now given us a far more complicated portrait to hold alongside it. The ancient DNA drawn from those 442 Viking Age individuals tells a story that cuts directly against the stereotype. When researchers examine the pigmentation-related genes in those samples, they found something that surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. The frequency of alleles associated with dark hair in Viking Age genomes was not only significant, it actually exceeded the frequency found in modern Danes. Black hair alleles appeared more commonly in those Viking samples than they do in the contemporary Danish population. Read that again slowly because it inverts the assumption most people carry. If anything, the blonde tendency in modern Scandinavia may partly reflect changes that happened after the Viking Age, not a preserved inheritance from it. Pigmentation-related loci in Viking genomes differ markedly from those of present-day Danes, which tells us that the population has not simply continued unchanged from the Viking Age to the present. Something shifted over the last millennium. Population movements, selection pressures, the gradual smoothing of earlier diversity through subsequent contact and change. All of these things contributed to the genetic portrait of modern Scandinavia. The blonde, light-eyed Northern European is a real type, clearly. But projecting it backward through time as though it defined the Viking Age is not supported by what the bones and the ancient DNA actually say. What Viking Age Scandinavia offered instead was a mosaic. Hair colour ranging from dark brown and black through auburn and chestnut to lighter shades. Eye colour spread across the spectrum rather than concentrated at one end of it. Regional variation layering on top of individual variation, with the coastal populations carrying even more diversity because of the continuous influx of ancestry from southern Europe and the East. The 3 genetic clusters described in the previous section each had their own pigmentation tendencies, and none of them mapped cleanly onto the uniform blonde ideal. A warrior buried in a Danish coastal grave might have carried dark hair genes, A woman interred in a Norwegian fjord settlement might have been lighter or darker depending on which strand of her ancestry happened to dominate. The Viking Age did not produce one look, it produced dozens. So where did the uniform blonde image come from, and why did it stick so firmly? The answer lies primarily in the 19th century, and in the particular needs of nation building. As Scandinavian countries work to construct coherent national identities during that period, they reach backward into the Norse past for material. Romantic art and literature found in the Viking Age a source of heroic imagery that could be shaped to serve contemporary purposes. Painters depicted Norse warriors as luminous, fair-haired figures standing against dramatic northern skies. Sculptors carved idealized heroes whose features owed more to classical European ideals of noble beauty than to anything suggested by actual skeletal evidence. Illustrated histories presented Vikings as the racial and cultural ancestors of modern Scandinavians, projecting 19th century ideas about ethnicity and national character onto people who had lived 1,000 years earlier and would not have recognized such categories. This was not random or accidental. The blonde Viking served a specific ideological function. He embodied a particular vision of Northern European identity at a moment when questions of nationhood, race, and cultural inheritance were charged with political energy. The image of the fair Norse hero connected the contemporary citizen to a mythic past, offering both pride and a sense of pure, unbroken lineage. It was, in short, a useful fiction, and useful fictions tend to persist long after their original context has dissolved. Popular media then carried that image forward through the 20th century and into the 21st. Films, novels, television dramas, video games, all of them drawing from the same well of 19th century romantic imagery, rather than from the archaeological and genetic record. The horned helmet had already been debunked, but the blonde warrior survived every correction because the emotional appeal of the image remained powerful. Heritage tourism built around it. Reenactment communities adopted it. The myth became self-reinforcing, each new representation borrowing from previous ones rather than from primary evidence. This is not an argument against celebrating Viking heritage or finding genuine pride in the Norse past. It is simply a case where the evidence and the popular image have diverged so far that the gap is worth examining honestly. The corrective is not to replace one simple image with another, swapping the blonde stereotype for a dark-haired one. The point is that no single image captures what Viking Age Scandinavia actually looked like. The population was too mobile, too interconnected with outside worlds, too shaped by centuries of coastal exchange and gene flow to collapse into a single physical type. It is also worth noting carefully that the genetic predictions themselves carry uncertainty. Phenotype prediction from ancient DNA depends on models built from contemporary populations, and those models may not fully account for the ways historical variation unfolded. Saying that dark hair alleles were more common than expected is a confident statement. Saying precisely what any given individual looked like is harder. The science points toward diversity and away from uniformity, but it cannot reconstruct faces with the precision of a photograph. What it can do, and what it does clearly, is refute the idea that the blonde, blue-eyed Viking was the standard. The gene flow from southern Europe and from the east that shaped especially the Danish and Swedish clusters brought pigmentation alleles into the Viking Age population that simply do not fit the romantic image. The coastal diversity that made harbour settlements so genetically varied also made them physically varied in ways that contemporary visitors from outside Scandinavia might have found familiar rather than exotic. And this matters for the main question this story is asking. If modern Scandinavians carry inherited traits from the Viking Age, those traits are not the uniformly fair colouring of the legend. They are something more varied, more layered, more honestly representative of a population that spent 3 centuries moving across half the known world and absorbing outside ancestry along every route they travelled. The blonde Viking is a 19th century portrait hanging in a museum of national imagination. The actual genetic inheritance from the Viking Age is something richer, stranger, and considerably harder to reduce to a single face or a single shade of hair. So those roots matter enormously, not just as lines on a map, not just as corridors for silver and furs and amber, but as the actual physical mechanism through which new ancestry entered Scandinavia and began, quietly, over generations, to shift what the people of the north looked like. The ships carried goods, they carried ideas, and they carried people, willingly and otherwise, back along the same waterways that had launched them outward in the first place. Think for a moment about what the Viking world actually connected. To the west, Ireland and England and the coastline of Francia. To the south, the Mediterranean world through the straits and around Iberia. To the east, something far more remarkable, a chain of rivers cutting down through what is now Russia, the Volga and the Dnieper, flowing through the vast interior of the continent and emptying eventually into the Caspian and the Black Sea. Along those eastern routes, Scandinavian traders and raiders reached the Abbasid Caliphate, Byzantium, and the settled peoples of the Asian steppe. They traded silver, furs, and slaves. They sat in markets in Baghdad and Constantinople. They negotiated with rulers whose worlds were separated from the fjords of Norway by thousands of miles and entire civilizations, and they came home. Not all of them, but enough of them, and not always alone. The genomic study of 442 Viking Age individuals published in Nature in 2020 found that explaining the genetic makeup of several Viking Age groups required something that went well beyond the familiar ancestral components of European hunter-gatherers, early farmers, and steppe peoples. The models needed an additional Eastern source, specifically something related to East Asian ancestry, described in terms of a Xiongnu-related component, a reference to the nomadic confederacy that dominated the Eurasian steppe. This is not a marginal signal. It is a detectable presence in the genetic record, and it points towards sustained contact with populations far to the east of anything we typically imagine when we picture the Norse world. A man rowing a longship across the Baltic might carry in his genome a thread of ancestry that traced back through steppe traders and river routes to a world his Danish neighbour would never see. Southern Europe contributed too. Gene flow from that direction was substantial, and the pathways are not difficult to imagine. The Western Mediterranean routes brought Scandinavian ships into contact with Frankish, Moorish and Byzantine populations. Raiding parties along the coast of France and Iberia did not simply burn and leave. Some settled. Some took captives north. Some returned with companions who had chosen to follow or who had been given no choice. Marriage alliances between Norse leaders and families of other cultures were part of the political vocabulary of the age. Mercenary service, particularly the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, placed Scandinavian warriors directly inside one of the most cosmopolitan cities on earth, a city where Greek, Arab, Armenian, Bulgarian, and Slavic populations moved through the same streets, and sometimes intermarried across those boundaries. Some of those men came back to Scandinavia. Some brought families or partners with them. The genome of their children would have reflected that. Slavery is an uncomfortable part of this history, but it is an honest one. The Viking trade in captives was extensive. Slaves taken from the Baltic coast, from Slavic territories, from Ireland, from England, were transported south along the river routes to markets in the Islamic world, but not all of them left Scandinavia. Many remained. Enslaved people integrated into Scandinavian households, worked Scandinavian land, raised children in Scandinavian communities, and over generations their descendants became part of those communities in ways that the social category of thrall would eventually obscure. The genetic signal of that integration is visible in the admixture patterns the study detected. Southern European and Eastern ancestry appearing in Scandinavian coastal populations is not only the story of travellers who came back from distant shores, it is also the story of people who arrived with no choice in the matter, and then, quietly, became part of the place that had taken them. And where did all of this mixing first become visible? Not in the interior valleys, not in the high fjord communities where movement was restricted by terrain and tradition. It became visible first and most clearly in the coastal settlements. Places like Birka on the Swedish coast, Hedeby at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, Ribe on the North Sea shore, Dublin where Norse settlers had built a thriving port on Irish soil. These were the diversity hotspots the genetic study identified, places where restricted gene flow within the broader Scandinavian interior gave way to something much more fluid. A merchant arriving at Birka from the Volga route, a craftsman following trade networks from the Rhineland, a woman brought north from somewhere along the English coast. All of these people passed through the coastal harbours first, and it was there that new ancestry began to weave itself into the local fabric. Stand in one of those ports on a busy trading day in the 9th century and watch who moves through it. You would see Norse speakers alongside Slavic speakers, alongside Frankish merchants, alongside men who had come north from the Byzantine world carrying Eastern goods. You would see faces that varied as widely as the routes they had travelled. The coastal settlement was not ethnically uniform. It was, by the standards of its age, extraordinarily connected, and that connection showed in the people themselves. What happened to that ancestry over subsequent generations is where the story becomes more careful and tentative. Some of it dispersed inland as coastal families moved, married, and settled new territory. Some of it concentrated in certain lineages and diluted in others. The genetic inheritance of those contacts did not spread evenly across Scandinavia, which is part of why the study found restricted gene flow within the interior, even while coastal populations carried more varied profiles. But over centuries, some of that diversity did move northward and inward, carried in the ordinary migrations of families who had no idea they were participating in the long-term reshaping of a population. Whether any of this is legible today in the faces of modern Scandinavians is a question that has to be held with humility. The genetics can detect the presence of southern and eastern ancestry in Viking Age samples. It can model the pathways through which that ancestry might have moved. What it cannot do with confidence is draw a straight line from a specific genetic signal in a 9th century coastal burial to a specific feature in a 21st century face. The models that predict physical appearance from ancient DNA are built on contemporary data, and the relationship between genes and phenotype is rarely as direct as popular accounts suggest. The science points toward greater diversity in the Viking Age than the legend allows. It cannot yet tell us exactly how that diversity expressed itself in living people, or precisely how much of it persisted through the turbulence of the subsequent millennium. What it can say is that the maritime routes were not one-directional. They did not simply carry Scandinavians outward to reshape other peoples. They carried other peoples back, in the bodies of returnees, in the presence of captives, in the choices of those who followed Norse ships north for reasons of their own. The longship was not only an instrument of expansion, it was also, quietly, an instrument of return, and every return carried something new into the communities that waited along the northern shores. But here is where the picture shifts in a way that almost no one expected when the DNA work began. Because when researchers looked closely at the genetic relationships between the individuals buried in these sites, they found something that cuts against the most persistent image of the Viking raider, the solitary, sea-hardened warrior, unmoored from family and kin, bound only to his ship and his sword. What the graves revealed was something far more human, and in many ways far more complicated. Consider a small island at the mouth of the Gulf of Riga, off the western coast of what is now Estonia. The island of Saaremaa, known in the medieval sources as Ussel, where 2 boat burials were discovered near the village of Salme and excavated in the early 2000s. These burials date to around 700 to 750 AD, placing them at the very dawn of the Viking Age, before the raid on Lindisfarne that most people treat as the beginning of the story. The ships themselves are remarkable. Clinker-built, meaning constructed with overlapping planks in the distinctive Norse style, they are the earliest sailing vessels of that type ever found in the Baltic Sea. They were not longships in the mature sense, not the sleek ocean-crossing vessels that would come later, but they were clearly built by people who already possessed the seafaring knowledge that would soon reshape half the known world. The smaller of the two ships held 7 bodies. The larger held 34. Together, 41 men, all of them between roughly 18 and 45 years old, many of them bearing the unmistakable marks of violent death. Cut marks on bone, stab wounds, injuries consistent with combat at close quarters. They had been buried with extraordinary care and considerable wealth. Swords, shields, gaming pieces, the kind used in the Norse strategy game Hnefatafl, falconry hawks, whose bones were found alongside the men, as if whoever laid them out had wanted them equipped for leisure as well as war. Even dogs were buried in the ships, curled at the feet of the dead as though the voyage might continue somewhere beyond the reach of the excavator's trowels. All of this was striking enough on its own, but the ancient DNA analysis that followed changed the story entirely. 4 of the men in that larger ship were brothers, full brothers, sharing both parents, their genetic relationship confirmed beyond reasonable doubt by the genomic data. They had been laid in the ship in 4 layers, one upon the other, as if whoever arranged that burial had wanted their bond made literal in the way they were placed, stacked together, inseparable even in death. A 5th individual buried nearby was a close relative, likely an uncle or cousin in the same family line. An isotopic analysis of their teeth, which records the chemistry of the water and food consumed during childhood, confirmed that they had grown up in central Sweden, in the Mälardalen region, the area around what is now Lake Mälaren, not far from where Stockholm would one day be built. So here is what those findings actually describe. A Swedish family, living in the early 8th century, who organised a voyage across the Baltic Sea together. Not a fleet of strangers recruited from different settlements and bound by nothing more than shared greed or seasonal restlessness. A family, brothers who had likely grown up in the same household, trained together, perhaps raided together before, who chose to sail across open water in company with one another and face whatever waited on the far shore. What waited, it appears, was defeat. The battle injuries suggest a violent end, and the local Assyrian population of Saaremaa seems to have been responsible for the killing. The bodies were buried with honour, perhaps by survivors, perhaps by enemies following customs of their own, perhaps by a combination of the two. But the story those 4 brothers tell is not primarily a story about how they died. It is a story about how they travelled, and why that matters for everything we're trying to understand about ancestry and mobility, and what the Viking Age actually was. When the Nature Genomics study of 2020 examined this and other sites, it noted explicitly that Viking expeditions included close family members, not as an anomaly, but as what appears to have been an established pattern. A family sending out its sons together was not sending away individuals who might or might not return and whose fate would be unknown for months. It was committing a shared stake in a collective enterprise, spreading both the risk and the potential reward across a kin group. The older men who organised such voyages would have understood the calculus. If the expedition succeeded, the family's wealth, status and territorial reach grew together. If it failed, the loss was felt by everyone, but at least the dead had gone together and could be remembered together. Think about what this means for the spread of ancestry across the Baltic world. A family-based expedition was not moving one man's genetic contribution from central Sweden to the coasts of Estonia. It was moving a lineage, a cluster of closely related individuals whose children, had they survived and settled, would have carried a concentrated version of Mälardalen ancestry into a completely different region. And the Salme brothers were not the only example. The genomic study found close kinship relationships at multiple sites, suggesting that what happened on Saaremaa was representative of something broader, a recurring pattern in which the Viking ship carried not just warriors, but family networks, organised for collective purpose. This family-based mobility had consequences that ripple outward in several directions at once. It affected the spread of ancestry clearly, concentrating certain genetic signatures in unexpected places rather than distributing them evenly. But it also affected the spread of customs, because a family travelling together carried its practices and beliefs as a coherent package, not just individual habits, but a shared culture, a way of organising households and marking status and relating to the gods, and it affected the spread of social status, because kin-based expeditions were not simply military exercises. They were also, and perhaps primarily, attempts by family groups to extend their reach, establish new connections, and improve their position within the competitive hierarchies of the early medieval Norse world. The grave goods buried with the Salm men speak to this. The swords, the gaming pieces, the hawks. These are not the possessions of desperate men with nothing to lose. These are the possessions of a family with things to prove and resources to spend, men who set off across the Baltic carrying objects that signalled leisure, learning, and martial prestige. The hawks in particular are striking. Falconry was a high-status pursuit, the kind of skill that marked a man as belonging to an elevated social world. Someone packed those birds onto a ship and brought them along on a voyage that ended badly. And that detail says something about the kind of people who went on these expeditions and what they imagined themselves to be. The simplistic image of the Viking raider, the brutal opportunist driven by nothing more than hunger and violence, dissolves when you stand over those four brothers in their layered grave. What you see instead is planning and kinship, and shared risk borne by people who knew each other as deeply as any people can know one another. The ships that left the Baltic shores in that early period were not random gatherings of the restless. They were, at least sometimes, family enterprises, organised with care, weighted with affection and obligation, and sent out into a sea that cared nothing for any of those things. And yet, as important as those family bonds were, the story does not end with Scandinavian brothers sailing together, because the genomic work revealed something equally striking on the other side of the equation, something that challenges the very category of Viking identity at its root. Consider two men buried in Orkney. The islands sit off the northern tip of Scotland, surrounded by some of the most treacherous water in the North Atlantic, and they were deeply embedded in the Norse world. Viking settlers reached Orkney early, established farms and harbours, left their language in place names that survive to this day. So when archaeologists uncovered two male skeletons buried with swords and other classic Viking grave goods, the assumption would have been straightforward. Here clearly were Norsemen, warriors who had sailed from Scandinavia and been interred in the style they had always known. But the ancient DNA told a different story entirely. Their genetic profiles matched present-day Irish and Scottish populations, consistent with the indigenous Pictish people of the region. Not Scandinavian, not even close. Yet they had been buried with the weapons, the objects, the formal arrangements that archaeologists associate with Viking warrior identity. Someone had made a deliberate choice to send these men into the afterlife in Norse fashion, and the men themselves may well have made that choice while they were still alive, presenting themselves to the world through the visual language of Viking material culture. This is what the 2020 Nature study, drawing on 442 ancient genomes, concluded explicitly, that Viking identity functioned as a cultural affiliation, not a genetic category. The word Viking in the period we're discussing referred to a way of going, a way of organising one's life around seafaring, raiding, trading, and the martial values that accompanied all of those things. It was closer in some respects to a profession or a mode of existence than it was to an ethnicity. And professions, modes of existence, can be entered by people of many different origins. The Pictish people of Scotland offer perhaps the clearest example of what this looked like in practice. The researchers noted that many Pictish individuals appear to have culturally become Vikings, not through any change in their ancestry, not through intermarriage alone, but through a process of cultural adoption that left its marks in the archaeological record. They wore Norse dress, they carried Norse weapons, they may have spoken Norse alongside their own languages, or even primarily. They participated in the networks of exchange and obligation that structured the Viking world, and when they died, they were sometimes buried in Norse fashion, with goods that signalled their belonging to a community defined not by blood but by shared practice. Think about what this means for how we read an archaeological site. A grave filled with swords and shields and finely worked metal objects, a burial that every outward sign tells you belongs to a Viking warrior, may have belonged to a man who had never set foot in Scandinavia, whose parents had never set foot in Scandinavia, whose ancestors had lived in the same hills and valleys of northern Britain for generations before any Norse ship appeared on the horizon. He may have joined a mixed crew, learned the seafaring skills, adopted the dress and weapons, built his identity around a culture that was not genetically his, but that was, by the time he died, genuinely his in every way that mattered to him and to the people around him. This means that outward appearance, burial style, grave goods, and even cultural affiliation tell us remarkably little about genetic ancestry, and genetic ancestry in turn tells us remarkably little about how a person understood themselves or was understood by others. Culture and genetics do not map neatly onto each other. They never did, and the Viking world is one of the most vivid demonstrations of that fact in the entire archaeological record. The blending worked in multiple directions. Scandinavians absorbed people from outside their world. Non-Scandinavians absorbed Scandinavian culture. The gene flow documented in the genomic study ran both ways, bringing ancestry from southern Europe and from further east into Scandinavian populations, while Scandinavian ancestry moved into Britain, Ireland, the Baltic coast, the Frankish territories, and beyond. The result was not a neat genetic signature spreading outward from a single source. It was a mosaic, constantly shifting, with local populations and incoming settlers exchanging ancestry, customs, and objects in proportions that varied from place to place and generation to generation. What this means for appearance is genuinely complicated, and it is worth sitting with that complication rather than resolving it too quickly. If a man from Pictish Scotland buried in Norse fashion had dark hair and blue eyes, or brown eyes, or whatever combination his own ancestry had given him, and if a man from central Sweden buried nearby had a different combination of features, the visual diversity within a single Viking community may have been considerable. Not all of them look the same. They could not have, given everything we now know about where they came from. The assumption that a Viking burial tells you what a Viking looked like runs directly into this problem. The culture was portable. The genetics were their own. The family-based raiding party discussed in the previous burial sites confirms that tight kinship networks existed within the Viking world. But those networks existed alongside something else entirely. The open door that the Viking way of life represented to people who wanted in. A young man from Orkney with Pictish blood in his veins who demonstrated courage on a ship, who could handle a blade and navigate rough water and hold his own among Norse-speaking sailors, could apparently move into that world and make it his own. The culture absorbed him even as he adopted it. This is not a minor footnote to Viking history. It is something close to its defining characteristic. The Vikings were exceptional seafarers and fearsome raiders, but they were also, and perhaps more durably, the architects of a cultural identity expansive enough to include people of many different backgrounds. The longship was not only a vehicle for moving Scandinavian genes across the sea, it was a vehicle for moving an idea about what it meant to live, and the idea proved far more transferable than any genetic inheritance. So when someone today visits a museum in Oslo or Bergen or Copenhagen, stands before a Viking sword or runs a hand along the gunwale of a reconstructed ship and wonders whether that heritage belongs to them, the answer the genomic evidence suggests is more generous than the old ethnic categories allowed. Viking identity was always, to some meaningful degree, something you could join rather than only something you were born into. The Irish descended man buried with his sword in Orkney understood something that the later romantic image of the blond Norseman obscured, that the Viking world was built from many kinds of people, and that what held them together was not blood alone, but a shared and demanding way of moving through the world. The consequences of that openness ripple forward into everything that came after, including the genes and faces of the people who live in Scandinavia today. But those consequences were not only social, and they were not only written in the choices people made about who to raid with or who to bury as one of their own. Some of the most durable legacies the Viking Age left in the bodies of modern Scandinavians have nothing to do with swords or grave goods or the adoption of a cultural identity. Some of them are written in the quiet chemistry of digestion. Consider what it would have meant to keep cattle through a Scandinavian winter in the 9th century. The growing season was short, the soil in many coastal regions thin and reluctant. Grain could be stored, but storage came with its own uncertainties. Rot, rodents, the simple arithmetic of too many mouths and too little harvest. Meat could be smoked or dried, but slaughtering animals too early meant fewer animals in spring, fewer calves, fewer hides, fewer draft animals for the following year. In this tight, precarious economy, the most valuable thing a cow could offer was not its flesh, but the steady, renewable resource it could provide while still alive. Milk. And not just for children. For adults working through the cold months, for warriors preparing a crossing, for families scraping through February with the spring still weeks away, milk and the foods made from it, the soft cheeses, the fermented curds, the thickened creams, represented something close to irreplaceable. There is only one problem. Most adult mammals, including most adult humans for most of human history, cannot properly digest fresh milk. The ability to break down lactose, the sugar that makes milk what it is, typically fades after childhood in people whose ancestors had no particular reason to keep producing the enzyme responsible. Drink a cup of milk as a lactose-intolerant adult, and the consequences range from uncomfortable to debilitating. Your gut becomes a site of fermentation rather than digestion, and the energy you are hoping to absorb largely escapes you. The ability to keep digesting milk into adulthood, what geneticists call lactase persistence, depends on a single mutation, a change at a specific point in the genome designated RS4988235 that keeps the lactase enzyme switched on long past childhood. It is an elegant example of how strongly the body can respond to the pressures of a particular way of living. People who could digest milk had access to a calorie-dense, protein-rich food source that others around them could not fully exploit. In a northern environment, in a culture that kept cattle and depended on animal husbandry as a central pillar of subsistence, that difference in digestive chemistry could translate directly into better nutrition, better survival through hard seasons, more children who lived long enough to carry the same mutation forward. What the genomic work on Viking Age populations revealed is that this mutation was not always common in the north. In Bronze Age Scandinavian samples, the lactase persistence allele was rare. By the Iron Age, it had climbed to roughly 37%. By the time the longships were sailing and the raids were beginning, it had reached frequencies already close to those we see in modern Scandinavians today. The selection pressure was strong, estimated by researchers at a coefficient of somewhere between 4 and 5%, which in the slow arithmetic of genetics is a remarkably powerful signal. Something about the Viking way of life, its dependence on cattle, its dairy-based food systems, its need for portable, storable, high-energy food on ships and during winter, was selecting hard for the ability to drink a bowl of milk and actually benefit from it. Picture a Norse farmstead in coastal Norway sometime around 850. There are cattle in the barn, their breath steaming in the cold. The family has a store of dried fish, some grain, and a collection of ceramic vessels in which milk has been fermenting slowly into something more digestible, since fermentation partially breaks down lactose even in people without the mutation. But the family members who carry the persistence allele do not have to wait for fermentation. They can drink fresh milk directly, absorbing more of what it offers, recovering faster from illness, maintaining body weight through the months when fresh food is scarce. That is not a small advantage. Over generations, across thousands of families making the same calculation, it becomes the genetic landscape of a people. The spread of this trait was not confined to one region of Scandinavia. The genomic evidence shows that lactase persistence rose across the 3 main Viking Age clusters, in Denmark, in Sweden, and in Norway, with only minor differences in frequency between them. This is consistent with what the rest of the genetic picture suggests, that the Viking world was not rigidly divided but networked, with people and genes and customs moving along the same sea routes that carried amber and silver and stolen cattle. The dairy economy was a shared strategy. and the bodies of the people who practiced it adapted accordingly, collectively across a wide geography. Today, somewhere between 80 and 90% of Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians carry that same allele. When a Swedish child grows up drinking milk at every meal without a second thought, when a Danish family runs a dairy farm on land that has supported cattle for over 1,000 years, when the cheeses and butter of Scandinavian cuisine feel as natural as breathing, part of that ease traces back to selection that intensified during the Viking Age and the centuries immediately preceding it. It is not a dramatic inheritance. It leaves no visible mark on face or bearing, but it is there, embedded in the metabolic machinery of the population, a reminder that the Vikings passed on something far more intimate than a genetic profile for hair colour or eye shape. They passed on an adaptation to a specific way of feeding themselves, a way of living that was inseparable from the cold coasts and the animal husbandry, and the long winters that shaped everything about who they were. There is a lesson here that goes beyond biology. We tend, when we think about what an ancestor passed on, to reach for the obvious things: the shape of a face, the colour of a strand of hair, the lineage of names in a parish record. But the genomic evidence from the Viking world keeps pointing towards something more complex and more interesting. What persists in a population is often the trace of how people lived and what they needed to survive, encoded in the body at a level invisible to the eye, but measurable by the instruments we now have. The lactase persistence allele is not a marker of Scandinavian appearance. It is a marker of Scandinavian history, of cattle kept through dark winters, of milk ladled into pottery vessels on farms that sat just above the waterline, of an agricultural and maritime economy under constant environmental pressure to make the most of every available resource. And if daily life can leave that kind of signature, one that persists for 1,000 years and more, then we should be careful about assuming we know all the ways the Viking Age still lives in the bodies and communities of modern Scandinavia. The visible inheritance, the faces that peer out from tourist brochures and museum reconstructions, is only one surface of a much deeper record. Beneath it, running quieter and in some ways more faithfully, are the chemical and genetic echoes of what people ate, how they kept warm, what they depended on to get through another year on the edge of the Northern Sea. The graves they left behind hold yet more of that record, and some of what they contain will surprise you. Open the ground at the right moment in the right place, and the Viking Age speaks back to you in a language older than writing, not in words but in objects, in the arrangement of bones, in the chemistry locked inside a tooth or a femur, in the angle of a healed fracture across a collarbone. The graves do not tell simple stories, but they tell honest ones, and if you listen carefully, they begin to fill in the spaces that the genomic data alone cannot reach. Genomics can tell you where someone came from. It can suggest what they may have looked like, with all the caveats that come with predicting ancient appearance from modern models. It can trace the movement of alleles across centuries and coastlines. What it cannot easily do is show you how someone moved through the world on a given day, what they ate for a meal that mattered, which joint had been aching since a bad winter crossing, what it cost the body to live an exceptional life. For that, you need the graves. You need what was placed inside them and what the bones themselves recorded. The Oseberg burial, which lies just a short distance inland from one of Norway's most storied fjords, was sealed sometime around the year 834. The ship it contained was not a raiding vessel, but something more ceremonial, a burial chamber built into the hull of a clinker-built longship 70 feet long, its prow carved into a serpentine spiral of extraordinary delicacy. When archaeologists opened it in the early 20th century, they found two women. One was around 50 to 55 years old at death. The other was approximately 80. In a world where most people wore out and faded by their 50s, 80 years was a remarkable span of time, and the skeleton told the story of what those decades had cost. The older woman's joints bore the unmistakable signature of severe arthritis. The cartilage that once cushioned her movement had worn away, leaving behind the telltale roughening and thickening of bone that comes from years of activity, from a body that had been used hard and kept going. She was not a woman who had lived in stillness. Whatever her role had been, whether as a high priestess, as some scholars have suggested, or as a chieftain's widow, or some combination of the sacred and the political, her body had been in motion for 8 decades, and it showed. The younger woman carried a different kind of mark. Her collarbone had been fractured at some point and had healed. Cleanly enough, but healed nonetheless. A fracture of that kind, in the 9th century, without surgical intervention, was a significant injury and a significant recovery. That she lived on and continued long enough to be buried at Oseberg with full ceremony suggests that she had status sufficient to command care and time to mend. And then there was the detail that keeps stopping people when they encounter it for the first time, a metal toothpick. Small, personal, almost intimate. In the 9th century, a metal toothpick was not a common object. It was the kind of thing that only someone with access to refined materials, to craft, to import networks that stretched well beyond a single fjord would possess. It placed her, quietly but firmly, in a social world of luxury and deliberate refinement. The diet those two women shared, revealed through isotopic analysis of their bones, was dominated by meat. In the Viking Age, fish was the dietary staple of ordinary people, the food of fishermen and farmers who lived close to the water and close to the margin. Meat, particularly cattle and horse, was different. It required land, labour, and the willingness to slaughter animals that could otherwise serve as a renewable resource. That both women at Oseberg were eating primarily meat marks them as elite, in a way that cannot be faked or adopted. It was written into their bones over years of meals, a slow chemical register of privilege. The grave goods confirmed what the bodies already said. 14 horses, an ox, 3 dogs, textile wealth so fine it still draws museum visitors from across the world. A red wool dress worked in a lozenge pattern, white linen, strips of imported silk sewn with care onto fabric that had crossed trade routes to reach a Norwegian coastal estate. Across the water, on the island of Saaremaa off the coast of what is now Estonia, a different kind of grave speaks a different kind of language. The Salm ship burials, which date to roughly 700 to 750 CE, predate the conventional start of the Viking Age, and yet they contain everything the Viking Age would come to define. 2 ships, both used as burial chambers, held the remains of 41 warriors. Most were men between 30 and 40 years old. Many of them had been injured. Some carried the marks of battle directly on their skulls. 3 bladed weapon strikes to the head on a single individual, the kind of wound pattern that tells you without ambiguity that this man was in the middle of something violent and close when he died. Isotopic analysis of their teeth links the majority of the Salm warriors to central Sweden. They had not grown up in Estonia. They had travelled, and the journey had ended badly. But here is the detail that brings the whole scene into sudden human focus. 4 of the men buried together were brothers. 4 brothers, from the same family, who had sailed together, fought together, and died together in a place far from wherever they had called home. Their presence in the same grave, identified through this patient work of genomic analysis, transforms the abstract narrative of Viking expansion into something more recognisable and more affecting. This was not an army in the modern sense. It was a group of men who knew each other, who had grown up around the same hearth, who probably left their home coast together in the same ship on what may have started as a raid or a trading voyage or both, as the two were often indistinguishable. The grave goods buried with them reflected their standing. More than 40 swords, shields, spearheads, iron fibulas, the bones of dogs and falconry hawks. The hawks are worth pausing on. Falconry was not a subsistence practice. It was expensive, time-consuming, and deeply associated with elite status across the early medieval world. That these men carried hawks, or had hawks buried with them as symbols of their rank, suggests that even in death, away from home, the people who buried them understood their standing and honoured it. What the graves at Oseberg and Salma share, despite the differences in gender and geography and circumstance, is this. They show us the lived experience behind the genetic signatures. The arthritis in the older woman's joints and the fracture in the younger woman's collarbone are not ancestry. They are biography. The battle wounds on the Salm warriors' skulls are not haplogroups. They are the last moments of a crossing that went wrong, recorded in bone with a precision that no chronicle of the period can match. And when we set this evidence beside the genomic picture, when we connect the meat-rich diet at Oseberg to the lactase persistence patterns spreading through the Viking Age population, when we connect the family structure of the Sound burial to the networks of kinship and migration that the DNA traces across the North Sea and the Baltic, what emerges is a portrait of people whose lives were simultaneously ordinary and exceptional. They ached, they broke, they ate well when they could, they travelled with their brothers, they brought their hawks. The graves do not give us abstractions, they give us weight, texture, and the particular gravity of individual lives embedded in a world that was moving, restlessly, in all directions at once. And perhaps the most striking thing is how much of that world, in ways we're only beginning to fully measure, is still moving in the people who live along those same coasts today. But before we leave the grave at Oseberg entirely, there is one more thing worth sitting with. Not the bones, not the textiles, not even the extraordinary intimacy of the metal toothpick. It is the ship itself. It is easy, when reading about the Oseberg burial, to focus on what was placed inside the hull. The women, the horses, the silk, the objects accumulate and demand attention, but the ship is not a container. It never was. It is the point. And if you stand in the long hall of the Viking Ship Museum in Big Doy, Oslo, and look at it for long enough, something shifts. The Oseberg ship does not feel like an artifact. It feels like something interrupted mid-thought, a sentence paused in the middle of its most important word, waiting to be resumed. 21.5 meters from stem to stern, 5 meters across at its widest, clinker-built from oak planks riveted with iron nails, each strake overlapping the one below in a method that distributes the flecks of open water across the entire hull, rather than concentrating it at any single point. 15 pairs of oar openings, which means up to 30 rowers working in rhythm across the water, a mast 9 to 10 meters tall capable of carrying a square loom sail of roughly 90 square meters, enough canvas to catch a decent wind and push the ship to something close to 10 knots. On a good day, with the right wind, the Oseberg ship could cover ground faster than most people of the 9th century could have imagined covering it. It could reach places that felt, to anyone watching from the shore, impossibly distant. What is remarkable about the hull is not simply its size, but its coherence. The curves are not approximate, they are precise. The shipwrights who built this vessel understood hydrodynamics not as a theory, but as accumulated knowledge passed from hand to hand across generations, refined through seasons of crossing water that rewarded competence and punished error without mercy. The bow and the stern rise in long, elegant arcs and terminate in spiralling carved prows decorated in the Oseberg style, the so-called gripping beast motif, interlocking animal forms that writhe and grasp at each other with a controlled ferocity that mirrors the energy of the ship itself. This was not decoration added as an afterthought. It was part of the identity of the object. The way the ship announced itself on the water, the way it said what it was before anyone aboard had spoken a word. Dendrochronology places the burial at the autumn of 834 CE. Though some of the timbers suggest the ship itself may be older, built earlier and then repurposed for a burial of exceptional ceremony. Which means that by the time it was sealed into the earth at Oseberg with 2 high-status women and a cargo of luxury beyond almost anything else surviving from the period, it had already lived a life on the water. It had already crossed something, carried something, been somewhere. The burial was not the ship's beginning. It may have been its 3rd or 4th chapter. That fact matters, because the Oseberg ship is not only a funeral object, it is evidence of what the Viking world had become by the early 9th century, and how it had become it. Ships like this one made the movements possible. Not just raiding, though raiding was part of it. Trade, exploration, the transport of families and livestock and ambition across distances that the land could not accommodate. The genetic signals that researchers now trace through ancient DNA from Scandinavia to Britain, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, and the Baltic all flow along the routes that ships like the Oseberg made navigable. Every haplogroup that crossed the North Sea, every family that carried its lactus persistence allele into a new coastal community, every brother who sailed alongside his brothers toward Estonia or Northumbria or the Seine, travelled in something built according to the same principles that shaped the hull sitting quietly in Oslo today. This is why the ship is not merely transport. It is the mechanism by which a culture reproduced itself across water. It carried people, yes, but it also carried identity, memory, social structure, language, and the knowledge of how to build the next ship. In that sense, the Oseberg vessel is less a relic than a node in a network, a single surviving point in a web of movement that extended at its height from the Arctic coast of Norway to the markets of Constantinople and the river mouths of North America. The web no longer exists as it did, but the node remains, and it is still speaking. There is something particular about the way Viking ships were embedded in the culture's understanding of itself. Ships appear in the sagas not as tools but as characters. They have names, they have temperaments. They are said to know their captains, to perform differently depending on who stands at the steering oar. Whether or not you take that literally, it reflects a relationship between Scandinavian maritime culture and its vessels that goes well beyond utility. The ship was the self projected onto the sea. It was the measure of what a community could build, what it could sustain, how far it could reach. To bury a high-status woman in a ship was not simply to provide her with transport for the afterlife. It was to place her within the highest expression of the culture's power and ambition, to say that she belonged to the same category of exceptional things. And then the ship went into the earth, and the earth kept it for more than 1,000 years, until the early 20th century when excavators uncovered it at Slagen in Vestfold, and the world saw what the 9th century had built and buried and left waiting. The modern fascination that followed was not simply nostalgia, it was recognition. Something in the shape of that hull, in the logic of the construction, in the carved prows that seemed to push through the air of the museum, the way they once pushed through water, resonates with people who have never sailed anything and never will. Part of that resonance is ancestral, in the broad cultural sense if not always the genetic one, and part of it is something older than ancestry, a response to the evidence of extraordinary skill applied to an extraordinary problem, the problem of how to move across open water safely, quickly, and with enough grace that the effort feels inevitable rather than heroic. That response is precisely what drove a group of builders, craftspeople and maritime historians to decide, in the early years of the 21st century, that the Oseberg ship needed to be sailed again. Not studied, not admired, sailed. The question was whether a vessel that had spent 12 centuries in the ground could be rebuilt well enough to prove that it still worked. The answer, when it came, was one that the original builders might have found gratifying. The ship that haunts the fjord was not done with the water, it was only waiting. The builders who took on the Saga Oseberg project in 2010 were not the first to try. There had been an earlier attempt, an earlier replica, and it had sunk. Not dramatically, not in some violent confrontation with the North Sea, but quietly, through a flaw that no one had anticipated, because no one had fully understood the original design. A hidden breach in the structural beams, the kind of detail that becomes invisible when you study a ship through drawings and measurements rather than through the physical act of making it. The earlier replica, known as the Dronningen, went down, and the knowledge of why it went down became one of the most important lessons the Saga Oseberg project would carry forward. Because the lesson was not simply about one structural weakness, it was about the fundamental difference between knowing something and knowing how to do it. The team that began work in 2010 committed from the outset to working exclusively with tools and methods from the Viking Age. No machine-cut planks, no industrial fasteners, No shortcuts borrowed from modern boat building. The oak timbers came from Denmark and Norway, selected and felled and shaped by hand. Each strake was hewn in the traditional way, following the grain of the wood rather than cutting across it. A technique that produces a plank of exceptional flexibility and strength, one that moves with the ship rather than resisting it. It is slower, more demanding, and requires a level of embodied knowledge that cannot be learned from a manual. It has to be practiced, corrected, practiced again, until the hand understands what the eye alone cannot teach. The hull was completed in 2012, and on the 20th of June that year it was launched from Tønsberg, the same coastal region where the original Oseberg ship had almost certainly been built over 1,000 years earlier. The launch drew attention not only from maritime historians and museum professionals, but from the Norwegian public, and from further afield, because the story of rebuilding a vessel of this age and this significance carried a kind of gravitational pull that went beyond archaeology. Something about watching a 9th century ship take to the water again touched the same nerve that the Oseberg burial itself had touched when it was uncovered in 1904. The past was not finished, it was arriving. The sail came from 3 women in Tønsberg who wove it by hand from the wool of free-range Spelsau sheep, a breed with deep roots in Scandinavian pastoral farming. The finished sail measured approximately 80 square metres, close to the dimensions estimated for the original. Wool, as opposed to linen or modern synthetic canvas, has specific aerodynamic and waterproofing properties that no other material replicates in quite the same way. The women who wove it were not professional weavers in the industrial sense. They were practitioners of a craft that the Viking age had depended on absolutely, one that had never quite disappeared from Vestfold even as it had retreated from most of the world. Their contribution to the saga Oseberg was not peripheral. The sail is what makes the ship move. Without it, the hull is an extraordinary sculpture. With it, the sculpture becomes a vessel. In March 2014, the saga Oseberg was taken out to sea under full sail. The conditions were not perfect, as they rarely are on the North Sea in early spring, but the ship reached approximately 10 knots under favourable wind, confirming something that scholars had long suspected, but never been able to demonstrate with a working replica. The Oseberg ship was not built primarily for ceremony or shallow coastal display. It was built to travel. It was built to cross open water at speed, to carry people and cargo across the distances that defined the Viking world. The burial had preserved the most ornate vessel of its type, the one decorated in the gripping beast style with carved prows of breathtaking complexity, and that ornamentation had perhaps allowed later observers to mistake it for something primarily symbolic. The sea trial said otherwise. Experts noted that modifications, including a structure called a skvetboard, would be needed for fully reliable open ocean sailing, and that remains a caveat worth holding. But the core principle had been demonstrated. The ship worked. What the reconstruction revealed, beyond speed, was the intelligence embedded in the original design, the way the hull flexes in moving water rather than rigidly resisting it, the way the clinker-built planking distributes stress across the entire structure, the way the shallow draft allows the ship to approach coastlines and beach itself with minimal infrastructure, no deep harbour required, no permanent dock, no fixed point of arrival. The Oseberg ship could land almost anywhere. That was part of what made it dangerous to those who saw it approaching from the shore, and part of what made it invaluable to those who sailed it, because a ship that can land anywhere is a ship that can go everywhere. None of this was discovered by reading about the original vessel. It was discovered by building one and sailing it, by putting hands on the problem and letting the problem respond. The experimental archaeology approach, learning through doing, sounds simple but demands an extraordinary commitment, both of time and of willingness to be wrong and to start again. The earlier replica sank. The saga Oseberg team learned from that, and built something that floated and sailed and moved through water the way the original builders had intended. The knowledge that was recovered is not the kind that lives in papers and reports, though those exist and matter. It is the kind that lives in hands, in the specific angle of an ad stroke, in the tension of a wool sail catching wind at a particular point of sail. Once lost, that kind of knowledge requires exactly this kind of effort to bring back. The saga Oseberg now operates as a living heritage attraction at Tønsberg, and the Oseberg Viking Heritage Foundation runs it as more than a museum piece. Visitors can board the ship and participate in what the foundation calls rotur, rowing trips in which members of the public take up the oars and move the 13-ton vessel themselves through the fjord. Workshops run alongside the ship, covering traditional shipbuilding, forging, and textile work. The Vestfold region, already significant as the site of the original burial, has become a destination shaped around this recovered maritime identity, a place where the Viking past is not presented behind glass but offered as something participatory, something you can place your hands on. The royal couple attended the 2014 launch, and media coverage of the sea trial spread through Norwegian and international channels with a velocity that reflected genuine public appetite for the story. That appetite is worth pausing over. The Viking Age ended roughly 1,000 years ago. The Oseberg ship was buried over 1,200 years ago, and yet the sight of its replica moving across a Norwegian fjord under a hand-woven wool sail touches something that does not diminish with distance or time. Part of that response is cultural, the accumulated weight of national identity built in part around this period and these vessels. But part of it is something more direct, a response to craft, to the evidence of human intelligence applied to a fundamental challenge, and to the particular kind of beauty that emerges when function and form solve the same problem simultaneously. The Viking past is not stable. It is continually rediscovered, reshaped, argued over, and reanimated, sometimes accurately, sometimes with romantic distortion, and the distance between those two versions is itself a subject worth examining. But the saga Oseberg sits at the more honest end of that process. It is not mythology, it is measurement, labour, and wood. It is the past made navigable again, not because the past demands it, but because the present keeps finding reasons to ask what the water once carried, and how far it went, and who was aboard. The ship carried more than people, it carried the conditions for everything that came after. When a Viking vessel beached on a foreign shore, what arrived with it was not only a raiding party or a trading delegation, but a language, a system of land measurement, a set of naming conventions, a way of marking family identity, a repertoire of artistic symbols that would take root in soil far from Scandinavia and grow into something recognizably local, yet unmistakably Norse. The saga Oseberg, restored and sailing again, is the most visible expression of that legacy, but it is only the most visible. The deeper traces are quieter, and they are everywhere. Walk through the villages of Lincolnshire or Yorkshire, and you're walking through a map of Viking settlement that requires no museum to read. The place names do it themselves. Grimsby, Thorsby, Scunthorpe, Kirkby. The suffixes tell the story. By meaning village, Thorpe meaning a secondary or outlying settlement, Kirk derived from the Norse word for church, holm for an island or raised ground in marshy terrain. These are not coincidences of sound. They are the residue of a wholesale linguistic transplantation, the moment when Norse-speaking families stopped raiding and started naming, which is the moment when people stop passing through a place and start living in it. The Danelaw, that broad swathe of northern and eastern England where Viking settlement ran deepest, left behind a density of Norse place name elements that historians and geographers have spent generations mapping. The map is not finished. New statistical analyses keep refining it, and caveats apply because some by-endings existed in pre-Viking Anglo-Saxon usage, and certainty requires archaeological context alongside linguistic evidence. But the broad pattern holds. People came from Scandinavia, settled, built, named, and stayed. The same pattern appears on coastlines that receive less attention. Swansea, in Wales, carries a name derived from Svinsey, meaning Swain's Island, a direct link to the presence of Norse traders and settlers along the Welsh coast. Around Dublin and the Irish Sea, a constellation of place names and surnames reflects the Norse-Irish lineages that formed when Viking settlers intermarried with local populations across several generations, creating communities that were neither purely Norse nor purely Irish, but something new, shaped by both. These were not passing contacts, they were family-based settlements of the kind that archaeogenetic studies have repeatedly confirmed, whole kin groups relocating together, the way the four brothers buried in the Salmi ship grave in Estonia suggest coordinated family expeditions rather than solitary wandering. The trade routes carried something equally persistent. When Scandinavian merchants and explorers pushed east along the Volga and the Dnieper, they entered the silver economy of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the evidence of that encounter has been recovered from the ground at Birka in Sweden, at Hedeby in Germany, and at Dublin in the form of silver dirhams, Arab-minted coins that travelled thousands of kilometres from their point of origin to be buried with their Norse owners. Those coins represent more than commerce. They represent a continuous exchange of ideas, of art, of technology, flowing in both directions along routes that connected Scandinavia to the Islamic world, with a regularity that challenges any notion of Viking culture as isolated or self-contained. What came back to Scandinavia on returning voyages, woven into the consciousness of travellers who had spent years moving through foreign courts and markets and workshops, changed the place they returned to. Some of those changes are traceable in art. In the small fishing town of Póvoa de Varzim on the Portuguese coast, there is a system of family identification marks called siglas poveiras, distinctive symbols used to identify boats, nets, property, and graves. They are deeply local, deeply embedded in the identity of the community, passed from generation to generation for centuries, and scholars who have studied them closely have identified their structural logic as directly derived from the Viking bemärken, the runic ship marks that Norse sailors used to identify ownership and family. The connection is not documented in any single historical record. It lives in the comparative typology of the marks themselves, in the patterns of coastline contact, and in the geography of the routes that Viking traders and settlers travelled. It remains plausible rather than proven, the kind of link that depends on accumulated circumstantial evidence rather than a single definitive source. But it suggests something important, that the influence of the Viking diaspora did not end at the edge of the known Norse world. It continued into communities that may not have thought of themselves as Viking at all, but carried the traces nonetheless, on their boats, in their symbols, in the way they signed their names. Normandy holds the same lesson in its very name. Norseman's land. The duchy that William of Normandy sailed from in 1066 to change the English-speaking world forever had been Viking territory for less than 2 centuries at that point, founded when Rollo and his followers were granted the region by the Frankish king in 911. 2 generations of intermarriage, language shift and cultural absorption had produced something that was no longer Viking in the old sense, and not simply Frankish either, but a new formation with Norse roots and Romance branches, whose ambitions and capabilities would eventually reshape 3 continents. The Viking diaspora did not merely leave deposits at its edges. It created the conditions for subsequent transformations that extended its influence far beyond the period itself. The continuity from those medieval settlements into modern identity is direct and in places deliberately cultivated. Norway's Viking festivals, the sailing of the saga Oseberg replica through Vestfold fjords, the heritage branding of Shetland and Orkney, the municipal symbols of cities from Dublin to Kiev that acknowledge their Norse foundations, the surname distributions in the British Isles and Iceland and Normandy that trace family lines back to the 9th and 10th centuries, all of these are expressions of the same underlying fact. The diaspora did not dissolve, it transformed, but its outline remained legible, and modern communities have found reasons to trace it. Those reasons are not purely antiquarian. The Viking Age has become one of the most commercially and politically potent periods in European historical memory, underwriting tourism industries, nationalist narratives, popular entertainment franchises, and identity claims that range from the scholarly to the tendentious. Scandinavia in particular has invested heavily in Viking heritage as a marker of distinctiveness, of maritime courage, of innovative craft, of a particular relationship to the sea. The Oseberg ship sits at the centre of that investment, as both a genuine archaeological masterpiece and a symbol of national identity that carries more interpretive weight than any single object can quite bear without distortion. What the diaspora left behind, then, is not only genetic, it is social and symbolic in ways that have proven more durable than biology, because culture can be chosen and renewed in ways that ancestry cannot. The Norse naming patterns in Lincolnshire, the bemärken encoded in Portuguese fishing marks, the silver dirhams buried at Birka, the family settlements in the Irish Sea Islands, the replica ship sailing again under a wool sail through Norwegian waters, All of these point to the same conclusion. Influence does not end when the raids stop. It continues through commerce, through memory, through the human habit of finding meaning in origin. The legacy of the Viking Age is still being constructed, still being argued over, still being carried forward by communities who may look nothing like the warriors of popular imagination, but who live, nonetheless, in a world those voyages helped to shape. All of that continuity, the place names, the trade routes, the ship marks on Portuguese fishing boats, invites a question that seems like it should have a clean answer by now. We have the graves, we have the bones, we have laboratories capable of reading genetic code from 1,000-year-old teeth. So what does the DNA actually tell us, and how much of what we think we know should we hold with confidence? The honest answer is more complicated than most headlines suggest, and that complexity is worth sitting with. The 2020 Nature study that swept through popular science reporting was a genuine landmark. 442 individuals from Viking Age burial sites across Scandinavia and beyond, their genomes analysed for ancestry, migration patterns, gene flow, and allele frequencies. The results were striking. They showed regional genetic clusters that broadly corresponded to modern Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. They revealed that dark hair was far more common among Viking Age individuals than popular imagery had ever suggested, with black hair alleles appearing at frequencies markedly different from those seen in present-day Danes. They detected gene flow from southern Europe into Denmark and from Central Asia into Sweden, tracing the routes along which people as well as goods had travelled. That is not a small achievement. It is the kind of evidence that fundamentally changes how we understand who was moving, and from where, during those few centuries of extraordinary maritime expansion. But read the study carefully, and you find something the headlines rarely carry. The researchers are measuring ancestry patterns and allele frequencies, not printing portraits. Those are very different things. When scientists attempt to predict what a specific ancient individual actually looked like, hair colour, eye colour, skin tone, they rely on a set of computational models known as the Hirasplex S system. The system works by reading particular genetic variants associated with pigmentation traits and calculating the most probable appearance. It is a powerful tool. It's not a perfect one. To produce reliable predictions, it requires genome coverage of at least 8 times, meaning each position in the relevant regions of the genome needs to have been read at least 8 times over to give confident results. Most Viking Age samples fall below that threshold. The ancient DNA extracted from a 1,000-year-old molar is fragmentary, degraded by time and soil chemistry, and the resulting genome coverage is often thin in exactly the places that matter for phenotype prediction. When coverage is low, the likelihood estimates become uncertain, and uncertainty in the underlying data propagates through the model until the predicted hair color or eye shade is less a reliable reconstruction than a statistical best guess surrounded by error bars that most popular accounts quietly remove. There is a further layer of complexity that goes even deeper. The genotype-phenotype models underlying Hirasplex S were built largely from modern human populations. They capture the relationships between genetic variants and physical appearance as those relationships exist today in living people. But the biology of a population living 1,000 years ago, shaped by different selective pressures, different dietary environments, different patterns of disease and survival, may not fit those modern models cleanly. We are reading the past through a lens ground for the present, and the distortion, while potentially small, is real and largely unquantifiable. Researchers acknowledged this openly when writing for scientific peers. The acknowledgement travels less reliably into documentary narration and social media posts about what Vikings looked like. Then there is the question of where the samples come from. 442 individuals sounds like a substantial data set, and for ancient genomics it genuinely is. But those individuals are not evenly distributed across the Viking world. The core Scandinavian sites are reasonably well represented. The peripheral and eastern regions, Estonia, Russia, the eastern Baltic, the steppe contact zones where Scandinavian traders met Central Asian populations and exchanged more than silver, have far fewer samples. When you try to measure genetic diversity or trace admixture signals in a region where you have a handful of genomes rather than dozens, your estimates become sensitive to which individuals happen to be buried in ways that preserve their DNA, which burial sites happen to be excavated, and which samples happen to survive the laboratory process. Each of those filters introduces potential bias. The result may be an underestimate of Eastern diversity, an overestimate of the distinctiveness of better sampled Western clusters, or a distorted picture of where and how frequently gene flow occurred. Good science papers flag these limitations in their methods sections. Good history reporting carries those flags forward rather than leaving them behind. What the DNA can tell us, and tell us with genuine confidence, concerns ancestry patterns at the population level. It can say that people carrying ancestry components associated with southern European populations contributed to the genetic makeup of Viking Age Denmark. It can say that individuals with Central Asian ancestry appear in Swedish burial contexts. It can identify that certain individuals buried with Norse material culture were not of Scandinavian biological descent, strengthening the argument that Viking identity was a way of life that could be adopted rather than an ethnicity one was simply born into. It can trace the spread of the lactase persistence allele across the Viking Age, showing a metabolic adaptation beginning to move through northern populations during exactly this period, a trait that persists in modern Scandinavians not as a fossil relic, but as a living inheritance from people who are finding new ways to extract nutrition from the herds and dairy animals that travelled with them. That is meaningful. That is the kind of story ancient DNA tells well. What it cannot do is license the claim that modern Scandinavians look the way they do primarily because of Viking raids. The Viking Age ended roughly 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years is a long time for additional migration, for selection pressure, for the drift of allele frequencies through populations that grew, contracted, absorbed neighbours, expelled outsiders, and shifted in composition in ways that no ancient genome study has yet fully captured. The faces you see in Oslo or Copenhagen today are the product of everything that came after the 9th century, as much as everything that came before it. Attributing a particular shade of hair or a specific eye colour to Viking raiding patterns specifically is the kind of simplification that feels satisfying and breaks down immediately under scrutiny. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a counsel of precision, which is something different. The story the DNA tells is genuinely extraordinary. A world more diverse, more mobile, more genetically complex than the horned helmet caricature ever suggested. The Viking Age was not a monoculture spreading across the sea. It was a moving, mixing, borrowing population whose genetic signature reflects exactly the kind of restless interconnection that the ships and the trade routes and the family burials all point toward. That story is better than the simplified version, not worse. It requires us to hold discovery and uncertainty together, to say here is what we found and here is what we cannot yet be certain of, and to resist the pull toward the clean narrative that does not quite fit the messy, fascinating evidence. The bones speak. They simply do not speak in simple sentences. So we return, at last, to the question that has been running beneath everything. How much of the Viking face actually remains in modern Scandinavians, and what does that even mean? The evidence gathered across centuries of archaeology, and now across years of ancient genomics, does not deliver a single clean answer. But it delivers something better than that. It delivers a layered one, honest in its complexity, richer for the uncertainty it acknowledges rather than conceals. Start with what the genetics confirm at the population level. The Viking Age did reshape the genetic landscape of Scandinavia, not through a single uniform wave of warrior ancestry spreading outward from some imagined northern heartland, but through the accumulation of thousands of individual stories. A trading family that settled on a Danish island, a woman from further south buried with Scandinavian jewellery in a coastal grave, a group of brothers who crossed the Baltic and never came home. Taken together, those stories left real traces. The three regional clusters that modern genetics can identify, broadly corresponding to Norway, Sweden and Denmark, have their roots partly in patterns of Viking Age movement and partly in the coastal geography that made certain routes more travelled than others. The greatest genetic diversity during the Viking period appeared along the coasts, where ships arrived and departed and where ancestry mixed most freely. That coastal diversity is not a coincidence. It is the direct biological record of a maritime culture in motion. The incoming ancestry matters here. Southern European gene flow entered Denmark. Central Asian ancestry reached into Sweden. These were not massive replacement events, not the kind of dramatic demographic turnover that earlier prehistoric migrations had produced. They were quieter contributions, the genetic residue of contact zones, trade relationships, and the occasional individual who crossed an enormous distance and settled, had children, and folded themselves into the fabric of a community that already existed. Their descendants are still here, carrying alleles that arrived with ships whose names are long forgotten. The Viking world was never closed. Its ports were points of exchange in both directions, and the DNA reflects that in frequencies too persistent to dismiss. Then there is the matter of specific traits, and here is where confidence must be calibrated carefully. Dark hair was common among Viking Age individuals, perhaps more common than most people looking at modern Scandinavians might expect. The allele frequencies for black hair appeared at significantly higher rates among ancient Danes than among their modern counterparts, and yet the modern population is not dark-haired. That shift tells us something important, not about the Vikings themselves, but about the centuries that followed them. The Viking Age ended around 1050. The 1,000 years between then and now were not genetically static. Selection continued. Migration continued. Allele frequencies drifted in ways that no current ancient DNA study has yet fully mapped. Because sampling coverage for the post-Viking medieval period remains thin, in the same way that sampling in the Eastern Baltic remains thin. The blonde hair and blue eyes that became culturally associated with Scandinavian identity are not primarily Viking legacies. They are partly the product of processes that came after, shaped by environments and pressures and population dynamics that extended far beyond the age of the longship. To attribute the appearance of a person in Stockholm today specifically to Viking raiding is to freeze history at an arbitrary moment and ignore everything that happened next. What did survive more directly is something less visible but more measurable. The lactis persistens allele, the genetic variant that allows adults to digest dairy milk without discomfort, rose in frequency during the Viking Age. It has continued rising since. Today it sits at levels that make Scandinavians among the most lactose-tolerant populations on Earth. That is a genuine Viking-era inheritance, not a physical feature you can see in a face, but a biological adaptation carried forward from people who were living alongside herds, who were making cheese and butter on ships and in longhouses, who needed to extract every calorie possible from the animals they kept, and the dairy those animals produced. That trait is in the modern body, quietly, persistently, doing exactly what it evolved to do, and then there are the limits that must be kept in view. The models used to predict pigmentation from ancient DNA were built from modern populations. They may not capture the full biological texture of 1,000 years ago. Sample coverage in ancient genomes is frequently too low to produce reliable individual phenotype predictions, whatever the headlines may suggest. The eastern and peripheral regions of the Viking world remain undersampled in ways that could be distorting estimates of diversity and admixture. These are not small caveats to be listed and then ignored. They are structural reminders that the science, as impressive as it genuinely is still reaching toward the past through instruments that were made in the present. What this means, taken all together, is that modern Scandinavian appearance emerged from the Viking era the way a river emerges from a landscape, shaped by what came before, altered by every tributary that joined it afterward, and never reducible to any single source. The Viking Age contributed regional clustering, coastal diversity, incoming ancestry from multiple directions, and metabolic adaptations that proved durable enough to carry forward across a millennium. It did not produce a uniform face. It produced a genetic mosaic, diverse in its origins, variable in its expression, resistant to the kind of easy characterization that popular imagination keeps reaching for. The family from the Salmi burial, those 4 brothers who died together in Estonia and were buried in the bow and stern of their ship, were not representatives of a single Scandinavian type. They were individuals with their own specific ancestry, their own particular combination of traits, their own story that ended violently and far from home. The woman buried in the Oseberg ship was an individual too, her identity and origin still debated, her grave goods speaking to wealth and ceremony, and a culture that lavished its finest craftsmanship on the dead. Every grave that has yielded ancient DNA is a specific person, not an archetype. The aggregate picture those individuals form together is richer, stranger, and more diverse than the legend has ever allowed. That is the honest answer to how much of the Viking face remains. Some of it is there, distributed unevenly across a population shaped by 1,000 years of further change. Some of what people assume is Viking, the fair colouring, the particular cast of Northern European features, arrived later or was never as uniformly Viking as the myth suggests, and some of what genuinely did survive, the metabolic adaptations, the regional patterns, the coastal diversity, is invisible to the eye but legible in the genome, waiting in laboratories and research papers for anyone patient enough to read it carefully. The legend and the evidence have always been in tension. The legend is cleaner, more dramatic, easier to paint on a shield or project onto a screen. The evidence is messier, more interesting, and ultimately more generous in what it reveals about who these people actually were. The ship haunts the fjord because the ship is extraordinary. But the people who built it and sailed it were more extraordinary still, precisely because they were human, complicated, and real. And so we come back to the water. It is always the water in the end. The northern seas that shaped the routes and the people who sailed them, the coastlines that kept the record when the voyagers themselves were gone, the fjords that still hold the silence of something ancient and unresolved. Whatever conclusions genetics and archaeology have drawn, however carefully the evidence has been weighed, the image that lingers is elemental. A ship moving through grey water, carrying people whose faces we can only partially reconstruct, toward a horizon we cannot see from here. The Viking Age left Scandinavia changed, not in the single dramatic way the legend prefers, not as a surge of identical warriors stamping a uniform appearance onto a population and moving on. It left Scandinavia changed in the quieter, more enduring way that genuine history always works, through movement, through mixing, through the slow accumulation of arrivals and departures, of families crossing open water together, of traders settling in port towns, of individuals from distant places folding themselves into communities along the Norwegian coast or the Danish islands or the Swedish interior. The 3 broad genetic clusters that modern research can detect, the rough outlines of what would become Norway, Sweden and Denmark, took their shape partly from this era, moulded by the maritime geography that determined which routes were travelled and which populations came into contact with each other. The coasts carry the most diversity still. That is not coincidence. That is the biological signature of a culture that measured its world in sea miles. The gene flow that arrived during this period came from directions that complicate every simple story about what a Viking was supposed to look like. Southern European ancestry entered Denmark. Central Asian lineages appeared in Swedish genomes. Dark hair was more common than the legend suggests, carried in allele frequencies that have since shifted across 1,000 years of subsequent change that no Viking ever lived to witness. The fair colouring that modern audiences associate so instinctively with the Scandinavian North is real, but its story is longer and more complicated than the long-ship age alone can explain. It was partly there, partly not, and partly the product of everything that came after, of selection pressures and migrations and demographic movements that extended well beyond the year 1050 and have never fully stopped. What did survive directly is distributed across the living body of modern Scandinavians in ways that blend the visible with the invisible. The lactose persistence allele, that practical adaptation that allowed dairy to become a reliable caloric source in cold northern environments, rose during the Viking period and has persisted ever since. It is not something you can see in a face, but it is one of the most measurable Viking-era inheritances still active in the population, carried forward from people who were living with their animals, sailing with their provisions, extracting every possible resource from a world that demanded resilience. That allele is in the body of a person in Oslo or Copenhagen today, doing quietly and efficiently exactly what it evolved to do across 15 centuries of continuous use. That is a kind of legacy that no museum can display, but no skeptic can dismiss. The graves speak in similar registers. The four brothers in the Salma ship burial were not a symbol. They were specific men with specific ancestry who died together and were buried in the vessel that had carried them across the Baltic. The woman in the Oseberg ship was a specific person, her identity still debated, her story still incomplete, her burial so carefully constructed that the ship itself became a monument not just to her death, but to everything her culture valued in life. These individuals are not the face of a type. They are the faces behind a legend, each one particular, each one irreducible to the simplified image that history has sometimes tried to impose on them, and yet they are connected to the present through the slow biological thread of ancestry, through the names embedded in coastal landscapes, through the shipbuilding traditions that the Saga Oseberg project revived in timber and rope and sail, through the museums and the shorelines and the cultural memory that modern Scandinavians carry forward without always knowing exactly where it came from. The raid shaped Scandinavia not by imposing a single inherited face on its descendants, but by setting the conditions for a movement and mixing that would compound quietly across centuries. The ships brought people home changed. They brought back ancestry, objects, ideas, and adaptations. They wove the North into a wider world and wove that wider world back into the North. What remains of that in modern Scandinavian appearance and biology is real, but it is distributed, partial, layered beneath subsequent centuries of change, and far more interesting for all of that complexity than any clean mythology could ever be. The ships are still there, in museums, in harbours, in reconstructions sailing under grey Scandinavian skies. The coastlines are still there. The graves are still yielding their quiet testimony. And somewhere in the genome of a person standing at the edge of the Northern Sea, looking out at the same water their ancestors crossed, the journey continues, patient and silent, carrying its evidence forward into a future that has not yet finished reading it.